Chapter 10, The Arctic Tern. Here's a stat that the doctors gave Mr. and Mrs. Spicer. 1 in 4. That's the last stat I'm going to give you because so what? So what? Stats don't mean anything. Every time Joe Pepitone steps up to the plate, it's new. It doesn't matter if he's hit 500 home runs or if he's struck out 500 times. It's a new thing. And no one can predict what's going to happen except that he's Joe Pepitone and he's going to try his darndest. And he's not going to let anything get him down. And he's going to fight his way through no matter what. And he's got all his friends behind him. And if you don't think that matters a whole lot, then you don't know how to get from first base to second. Because stats don't mean anything. On the first Saturday of June, I got to Spicer's Deli early since I figured Mr. Spicer would need my help because Lil wouldn't be there to load the wagons. I was right. When I got there, the first wagon wasn't even close to loaded. Mr. Spicer was standing in the back, one hand holding the orders, the other messing up his hair. "I can do that," I said. "Lil usually does it," Mr. Spicer said. "I know." I took the list from his hand. "Doug," he said, "I'm going to have to let you go. The hospital bills. You can't believe what they're going to be. I don't have enough to pay you anymore." "I don't have anything else to do on Saturday mornings," I said. I know, what a chump. But Mr. Spicer, he looked at me a long time. Then he nodded, hand back to hair. He went out front. I loaded the first wagon. At Mrs. Mason's house, she handed me an envelope with the money for the groceries and another $20 for the little girl, she said. Mr. Loeffler was waiting for me with a glass jar full of yellow tulips. "Will you see the little girl sometime soon?" he said. "Would you mind?" And he handed me the tulips. All the Daughtery kids were waiting for me when I got to their house, sitting on the front stoop. They were all holding pictures they had drawn of Lil getting better. In Ben, she was jumping over a fence. In Polly, she was riding her bike with the stupid basket in front of the library. In Joel's, she was flying over Washington Irving Junior High School. In Davy's, she was reading a huge stack of books under a tree. And in Phronsie, she was kissing someone. "Who is she kissing?" I said. They all started to giggle. Me. I was almost a chump, almost bawling in front of kids. At Mrs. Windermere's, she was waiting too. She opened the door into the kitchen and we put the groceries away, and I asked how the play was going, and she said it was going fabulous. And I asked about the girl Mr. Gregory got to replace Lil, and she said she was fine, but not nearly as good as Lil. And I asked about the shrieking, which I wasn't doing anymore, since if I was going down to New York City, it wasn't to be in a play. And Mrs. Windermere said someone else was doing it now. She wasn't sure who. Then she asked about Lil. I was a chump. When I got back to the deli, Mr. Spicer was bawling beside the cash register, just bawling, and not even trying to hide behind the flowers that were lined up in pots on the counter. All orchids. We were both chumps. But you know what? It's not so bad when you're chumps together. At the library, Mr. Powell had spread one of my sketches of the Arctic tern out on a table, one of the big sketches as big as Audubon's. "I thought we might try to work with some watercolors today," he said. "Perhaps we could start with the background." A box on the table held maybe 15, 16 circles of paint and a bottle of water. "Mr. Powell," I said, "we'll mix the colors until we get them right." "Mr. Powell, we don't have the Arctic tern plate anymore. How will we know?" "We have what we remember," he said. I sat down. I looked across the room to the table where Lil usually was sitting. "It will be a surprise for her," said Mr. Powell. He dipped the brush into the bottle. "Let's get the colors of the water first." He swirled his brush in one of the blues, then handed it to me. "What do you think?" he said. "It looks like a color from New Zealand," I said. "Let's see what happens if you start mixing them together, a little bit at a time." So I tried mixing them together a little bit at a time, and here's what happened. The right color came. We both saw at the same moment exactly the right color of the cold, smooth, frothy, deep water below the Arctic tern, not at all like New Zealand. "Now draw your brush evenly along the line. Right, right, keep on. Now let the brush up from the paper. Right, dip your brush again and start back at the top. Draw down, down, no, it's all right. Let the paint suggest the texture. Down, down, and again." That afternoon, I painted in 2 of the waves behind the Arctic tern. "How many times did you mess it up?" said Lil. "None." "Doug, you are such a liar." "You'll see it when you get back home." Then we were quiet because we didn't know when that was going to be, and I'm not lying, you won't want to be where Lil was for very long. If you took the blue paint for the waves and added some green to make it look like puke. That would be the color of the walls, and the tiles on the floor, and the curtains by the window, and the tube that led from a dripping bag into a needle that got stuck in Lil's arm somewhere underneath the tape. "Does it hurt?" I said. "How do you think a needle stuck up your arm would feel?" she said. "I think I'd start shrieking like an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years." "That's what it feels like," she said. "Do you want me to shriek for you?" I said. She thought about that. "That might help," she said. "You really do shriek pretty good, but then they might kick you out." I didn't shriek. She held out her hand, and I took it. "I loved playing Helen Burns," she said. "I just don't want to be Helen Burns. You can sit down on the bed, you know. It's not going to break, at least not because of a skinny thug like you." I thought, I'm not going to break either. 1 in 4, and I'm the one. I sat down on the bed. "When all this is over," she said, we're going to Broadway and see Jane Eyre. And then we're going to the top of the Empire State Building, and after that we're going to see the dinosaurs at the Museum of Natural History, and then we're going to walk down Fifth Avenue like we own it." A nurse came in. "It's time to draw some blood, honey, just a little poke. And afterward we'll go to Central Park, and you can sketch people and charge them $5 a drawing, and then we'll take the money and find she squeezed her eyes shut, "a French restaurant and eat stuff that we can't even pronounce." "Just a few more minutes," the nurse said to me. "She's tired, so just a few more minutes." Lil opened her eyes. "Someday I'm going to live in New York City," she said. "I'm pretty happy in Marysville," I said. Lil opened her eyes really wide, and maybe I did the same because it kind of surprised me too. But it was true. It really was. I was happy in Marysville. I didn't even know it until I said it, but it was true. "We'll find a way to compromise," Lil said. "No, we won't. We'll live in Marysville." Her eyes started to close. "You are such a jerk." She yawned. "It's cold in this room. You can lie down if you want and get under the blanket." That's what I did. She had to scoot over a little, and that wasn't so easy because she was attached to so much stuff. And we had to move the tube going into her arm so that I wouldn't lie down on it. That wasn't so easy either. But we hurried because we knew we had only a few minutes before the nurse came back, and I lay down next to Lil, and I put my arm around her and felt her relax into me, and when she spoke, it was only in a whisper. "Doug," she said, "I sure hope I'm the 1 in 4. "You are," I said. "Who says?" "Me." A long silence. I thought she was almost asleep. Then, "All right," she said, and that's when I knew. I knew that she was going to be all right. Don't ask me how, but I knew. I'm not lying. Not about this. Not ever about this. Stats don't mean anything, but some things mean everything. And that June, those things that mean everything, they kept coming, faster and faster. On the second Saturday after my deliveries, Lucas was waiting for me in front of the Marysville Free Public Library. I could tell he'd been out looking for work all morning. He had this tired, beat-up look, and it wasn't hard to figure out what he'd been hearing. "I'm sorry, son, nothing for you today. I don't think you could handle it. Don't waste my time." You'd look tired and beat up too if you'd been hearing that. "So you want me to pull you up the steps?" I said. He looked at me, and his face got hard for a second, like the old Lucas, but not exactly like the old Lucas. "You don't think I can do it myself?" "Lucas, you don't think I can handle it?" "I think you can handle anything," I said. "Darn right," he said. "Darn right, I can handle anything." He turned around and backed his wheelchair toward the 6 steps. Then he looked over his shoulder, leaned back, and pulled up on the front of the left wheel. Then he leaned back even more, and I'm not lying, the wheelchair started to go up the first step. Kind of crooked, but up, and then he began to fall over. I started toward him, but he leaned forward and caught it, and he had the left wheel up on the first step. Then he leaned again, and he pulled on the right wheel, and with a heft, there he was on the second step, balanced. He looked at me, sweating. "What do you have that goofy grin on your face for?" he said. "Do it again," I said. He backed up to the next step, leaned back, hefted up, sweated. "Not bad," I said. The third step, and he almost went over that time, but he caught himself and leaned forward a little bit more, and then the fourth and fifth, and then he drew himself back to the sixth and grunted and pulled and came back down onto the fifth. "No, stay put, little brother." I did. You would have too. He backed up again, waited for a moment, leaned to the left, and pulled up, squeezing his eyes tight, and brought the chair half up, then leaned to the right, squeezed his eyes again, and so came over the last step of the Marysville Free Public Library. He was breathing a little bit heavily. So was I. "Not bad," I said. "It's all in the balance," Lucas said. "You were a little slow." "I'll practice." That smile. Then the library door opened and out came, and you're not going to believe this, but it was June, and as true, out came Coach Reed from the library. I'm not lying. Pretty good, he said to Lucas. Thanks, said Lucas. It would take a lot of strength to pull yourself up like that. I guess, said Lucas. I guess, said Coach Reed. He looked at me. Your brother? I nodded. Jack Reed, he said to Lucas. Then he held the door of the library open so that Lucas could will himself through. Lucas probably didn't want him to, but after a day of trying to fit your wheelchair through the doors of places that didn't want you, he might have been glad to have someone hold the door. I looked at Coach Reed as I went through. He looked back at me. I went on in and over to the elevator. Hey, Coach Reed said. Lucas stopped and slowly spun himself around. And you know what? He looked like he was going to be okay. He might be tired and beat up, but he was going to be okay. That's what he looked like. And it was June. I bet Arctic terns fly strong in June. I hear you've been looking for a job, said Coach Reed. That's right, said old Lucas' voice. Any luck? Yeah, said Lucas. Yeah, lots of luck. Everyone around here says that a guy in a wheelchair is just the kind of guy they've been looking for. I'm trying to decide between, I don't know, 8 or 9 offers. Sounds tough. Lucas started to spin around again. Maybe you could come work for me, said Coach Reed. He really said that. June. But Lucas didn't believe him. Funny, Lucas said, really funny. You ought to be on stage. You could make a living telling guys with missing legs jokes. They're not as funny as guys with missing arms jokes, but maybe you could come up with some of those too. I'm not kidding. Lucas pulled himself closer. Still old Lucas. So, what do you want me to do? Coach track? Maybe the high jump or the pole vault? I'm a heck of a pole vaulter. Coach Reed looked at me and then back at my brother. Maybe track, maybe gymnastics. I saw you come up the stairs. Maybe weight training. I have a feeling you might be able to do a whole lot of things that you don't think you can. How do you know? Coach Reed looked at me again, because I was there too. Long silence. I need an assistant, said Coach Reed. Then maybe you better find someone who... Assistant junior high school gym coach. There are 2 weeks left in the school year. If you started now, you could get your feet wet and be ready for September. If you notice, I don't have any... Monday morning, 7 o'clock in the morning. We're beginning the last basketball unit. If you're there, the job is yours. That is, if you think you can keep a bunch of junior high kids from pulling any funny business on you. I won't be there, said Lucas. Coach Reed looked at me. Yes, sirree, Buster, I said. He'll be there. All right, Coach Reed said, and he went on down the steps. I think I could have kissed him. Lucas looked at me. I'm not going to take a job I can't do. You're right, I said. I don't think you can handle it. Lucas stared, like the old Lucas was going to say something, but the old Lucas didn't. Instead, Lucas nodded, and his face got all set and determined, and then he started to smile. He spun his chair around. Mrs. Merriam walked up. She had her glasses on so she didn't look so loopy. Lucas laughed. He laughed. Can I help you? She said to him. I think I'm fine, he said. We took the elevator upstairs. Lucas didn't mind the steel gate that we had to draw across, and he didn't mind the way the elevator rattled around on its way up, and he didn't mind the sound of the pulleys straining themselves, and he didn't mind that at the top the elevator stopped a couple of inches below the floor. He jerked his chair up and pulled himself over the lip. At the table where Lil usually worked, Mr. Powell was mixing watercolors. You're late, he said. Lucas had a job interview, I said. For what position? Assistant junior high school gym coach, said Lucas. We start a basketball unit on Monday. And you know what? I'm not lying. Mr. Powell didn't seem surprised at all. Make them do free throws, he said. Free throws discipline the mind and the eye and the hand. There's nothing like them. Lucas laughed. So good. Sounds like you know what you're talking about. Mr. Powell raised an eyebrow. I'm a librarian, he said. I always know what I'm talking about. Mr. Swedick, does this gray look right? We went over to the table, which you might remember my Arctic tern was on top of. Who drew this? Lucas said. He didn't need to lean down so close anymore. Your brother, said Mr. Powell. Lucas touched the edge of the paper. It's a copy, I said. My brother, said Lucas. He leaned forward. It looks like he's flying off the page. He's falling into the water, I said. Lucas shook his head. No, he's not. He's going wherever he wants to go. Exactly right, said Mr. Powell, and handed me a paintbrush. You know what it feels like to stroke color onto an Arctic tern flying off the page, going wherever he wants to go? Terrific. It was June, you remember. On Monday, Lucas left the house before I did, by himself, heading to Washington Irving Junior High School. I went down to the gym between periods to watch him practice free throws from his chair. The stats weren't so good, but if you remember, stats don't mean anything. During lunch, which I had again, I watched Lucas run basketball drills, and at the end of the day he was gathering up loose basketballs when I came in, and James Russell was calling out Coach Swedick. You think Lucas wasn't smiling when he heard that? You think I wasn't smiling when I heard that? I waved, and Lucas waved, and I went into Coach Reed's office. He had the presidential physical fitness charts spread out, and he was going through each one with his finger on the lines. He paused and looked up at me. "Thanks," I said. "Go home," he said. June. Somehow the message had gone out to all the teachers that the last 2 weeks of school were the last opportunity to bury the students of Washington Irving Junior High in work. Every other school in the country was getting ready for campouts and parties to celebrate the end of the year, but not us. In world history, Mr. McElroy was starting the causes of World War I. You know how many causes there were for World War I? No wonder they fought. In English, Miss Cowper said we were going to finish the year with selections from John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, which didn't sound bad because Charlie is a dog, and how bad could a dog story get? And it wasn't bad, except we had to keep notes about Steinbeck's technique because we were going to be writing our own travel accounts, fictional or non-fictional, for the year's final composition. Doesn't that sound all fired exciting? In advanced algebra, Mrs. Verne told us that she was going to end the year with an introduction to geometry, and when we pointed out that geometry wasn't taught until 10th grade, she congratulated us on our powers of observation and told us all to be sure to bring protractors the next day. In PE, we were practicing free throws every day, lots of free throws, because they were supposed to discipline the mind and the eye and the hand. I didn't complain to the coach. In physical science, Mr. Ferris announced that NASA had given the go-ahead, and in just a month, Apollo 11 would blast off to the moon. "This is what happens when you dream dreams," he said. He couldn't stop smiling, not even when he was describing the thermodynamics of the fuel for the Saturn rocket that would carry the command capsule and the LEM. Otis Bottom asked if we were going to make some fuel to see if it would explode. Even then, Mr. Ferris could not stop smiling. In geography, we had gotten all the way over to France, and Mr. Barber started us on maps of France under Louis XIV, or maybe it was the 15th, and we were supposed to copy all the important rivers and mountains and cities and towns and underline places that Louis XIV or 15th had visited according to geography, the story of the world. I'm not lying, the map that I drew was something that you would stop to look at. Audubon himself would have stopped and whistled, which is just what Mr. Barber did. Then he crouched next to me, and the scent of his coffee steamed up. "Douglas, did you trace that?" "Nope." "And those seagulls? I thought they would add realism." "They're fantastic," Mr. Barber said. "Thanks," I said. He whistled again. Then he stood up and took a step. You know one thing that Mr. Pell taught me? He taught me that sometimes art can make you forget everything else around you. That's what art can do. And I guess that's what happened to Mr. Barber, who forgot that his left foot was behind the back leg of my chair, who took a step without remembering to take his foot away from the back of my chair, who tripped but caught himself, but who couldn't catch the coffee that flew out of his cup, swirled around the air for a second, and finally splashed down all over my copy of geography, the story of the world, and started to soak into the pages as fast as it could. I won't tell you the sound that Mr. Barber made. It was something like the shriek of an insane woman who has been locked in an attic for a great many years would make. My father hadn't said a word to me, or much to anyone, since I'd seen Ernie Echo wearing Joe Pepitone's jacket. He wouldn't even look at me during supper, which was fine, just fine. My mother covered the silence with talk about orchids, and Lucas couldn't stop talking about his job as someone had threatened to bloody murder him if he said another word. "They call me Coach Swedick," he said. "Can you believe that? Coach Swedick." "Even if you can't shoot a free throw worth diddly," said Christopher. 75% from the free throw line, Coach Swedick said, which is a stat that he was probably stretching really far. Really far. "That's something you dreamed, you mean," said Christopher. "Chris, why don't you open your mouth, look up to the ceiling, and we'll see how many of these carrots I can make from here." "Lucas," said my mother. "It's all right," said Christopher. "I'm not going to do it." He'd probably get them all in, just for spite. "Isn't that right, Coach?" "Absolutely." My mother started laughing. You know how good it is to see my mother laugh? My father left the table. My mother stopped laughing. Lucas began eating his carrots. Christopher held his fork still over his plate. "Isn't the orchid delicate in this light?" said my mother. June. A week before Christopher's hearing, which the town of Marysville was taking its time setting up, probably to make him sweat, my father stopped eating supper with us. He'd fill a plate in the kitchen before we started and then go into the bedroom. He didn't come out afterward. So what? So what? No one cared, except maybe my mother. None of us talked about the hearing. None of us talked about what might happen. None of us used the word jail. Would you? Except at the hospital. At the hospital, I could talk about it. You know that your brother didn't break into the stores, right? Said Lil. I nodded. You're sure? I'm sure. Lil looked at me kind of slantwise. Then he didn't do it, and everything will be okay. Thank you, Judge Spicer. You're very welcome, so get out of your funk before I throw my bedpan at your head. Lil. But back at home, none of us talked about it, and meanwhile, I saw my father less and less, and whenever I did see him, he was sort of unstable. It's hard to say how exactly he looked like this, maybe because of the way he stood with his hands in his pockets, his eyes looking anywhere but at you, and bent over like he was hurting. Until the day before the hearing, when he came home from work late. He opened the door. I was helping Lucas with his weights in the living room, and he came in. He was carrying Joe Pepitone's jacket. It looked about as heavy as Lucas's weights. My mother came out from the kitchen. My father handed Joe Pepitone's jacket to me, his eyes looking away. Then he went into the bedroom. My mother followed him. When they came out, they went into the kitchen and put food on the table together, my father looking so out of place carrying a bowl of mashed potatoes. Then my mother sat down in her chair, and he sat down in his, and when my mother didn't speak, Lucas started to talk about this new drill he had come up with for dribbling around cones and then going to a layup. And my mother and father and all of us filled our plates with mashed potatoes and green beans and pork chops and a pork chop each, and Lucas and Christopher and me, we started to eat, but my father sat in front of his full plate, and my mother sat in front of hers, and they didn't eat. Not a bite. And Lucas talking about dribbling, and my mother and father looking at their full plates. The whole meal, they never said a word. Everything was quiet, except for Lucas. Then someone knocked at the door. My father looked at my mother, and my mother looked at my father. Could you answer that, Chris? Said my mother, and when Christopher got up to answer the door, my mother stood and walked over to his seat, and sat down and took my father's hand. Christopher came back in. Behind him, Mr. Daugherty in uniform. Evening, folks, he said. Sorry to bother you at dinner. He seemed huge in the house. Or maybe it was his uniform that seemed huge. If he sat down in one of our kitchen chairs, he would probably have broken it into pieces. He was that huge. Hello, said my mother and stood up. Hello, Mrs. Sweattick, said Mr. Daugherty, and he nodded his head. He looked at me. The kids all say hello, Doug. Tell them I say hi, I said. I'll do that. He turned to Lucas. I heard about the job, Coach. Can you guess what Lucas looked like when huge Mr. Daugherty called him Coach? Then Mr. Daugherty looked at my father and nodded. Mr. Sweattick, he said. My father nodded back, looking at my mother, never taking his eyes off my mother. Can you tell that not a single one of us knew what to say? My mother coughed a little bit. Would you like a pork chop? She said. Can you tell that my mother really did not know what to say? They look good, but I had better not, said Mr. Daugherty. I'm late for supper as it is, and you know what the missus will say if I can't eat a bite of what she's been cooking. He cleared his throat twice. Christopher, he said. The hearing isn't until tomorrow, said Lucas. There isn't going to be any hearing, said Mr. Daugherty. There's no noise in space. Did you know that? If one of the Apollo 11 astronauts decides to go for a walk around a space capsule, he won't hear a thing. There's no sound at all, sort of like in our house for about the next minute. Then my father stood up. Chris, he said, and stopped. Tried again. Chris? We got an anonymous tip, said Mr. Daugherty. We found all the stuff from the hardware store, everything, and the guy confessed to that and to the break-in at Spicer's Deli last fall. My mother got up and stood close to my father. The Marysville Police Department would like to apologize to you, Christopher, said Mr. Daugherty. Chris, said my father, the tip was anonymous, and as far as the investigating officer, who is me, is concerned, the case is closed. There won't be any more charges. My mother took my father's hand again. And I'm sure, said Mr. Daugherty, I'm really very sure that the person who phoned in the tip knows now that getting involved with something like this could wreck a whole lot of people's lives, not only his. I'm sure he does, said my mother. She went behind my father and put her arms around his chest. My father reached up and held on to her hands. And I'm sure he has a terrific family that he never meant to hurt, and he never meant to hurt them. I'm sure he knows now that they're all he really needs. He knows that too, said my father. Mr. Daugherty nodded. I'm sorry again, Christopher. If there's ever anything I can do for you... Thanks, said Christopher. See you Saturday, Doug. See you then." He turned and was gone. And you know what? The house was bigger. I'm not lying. It was like he left his hugeness behind him, and we had more room. And you know what else? It wasn't the dump anymore. It seemed, I don't know, maybe I'm just a chump. We all sat back down. We all looked at our cold mashed potatoes and cold pork chops, and we were all hungry. We started digging in like we hadn't eaten for a week. Christopher especially, and you can probably figure out why. Everyone eating and laughing at how fast we were eating, and eating even faster, mashed potatoes flying, Lucas belching and Christopher belching and me belching and my father belching. My father, who sat back in his chair when there was no more food on the table, who looked around at us, and who said, "Isn't that orchid the most beautiful sight you ever saw?" I looked at my mother. That smile. That June smile. And then my father looked across at my mother. "I mean," he said, "the second most beautiful sight you ever saw." The next morning, Principal Petey was waiting for me when I came into Washington Irving Junior High School. He told me to come by his office after Mr. Barber's class. Mr. McElroy already knew I'd be late for world history, and you'd better not try to get out of this, he said. He was smiling when he said it. When I got to his office, I didn't have to wait a half hour like usual. His door was propped open, and he was standing beside it, waiting for me. Guess what was off his wall and leaning up against his desk? Just guess. But the first thing that Principal Petey said was, "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I was wrong about a great many things, and I'm sorry." He held out his hand. I took it, and we shook. Then he pointed to the brown pelican. "That's yours now," he said. I nodded. "I always thought he sort of looked noble," I said. "That's not the word I was thinking of, but now that you say it," he considered the brown pelican. "Maybe so. Definitely noble," I said. If you want, I'll drive it over to the library," he said. "I'd like to take it myself," I said. He nodded. He studied the brown pelican for a long moment. "You know, Mr. Sweattick," he said, "I haven't told this to many students, but I'll tell it to you. I think that you're going to go wherever you want to go." That pelican, as sturdy as if all he had to do was watch the world. "Thanks," I said. "Now you'd better get on to Mr. McElroy's class. The bird will be waiting right here for you." I turned toward the door. "And Mr. Sweattick," Principal Petey said. I looked back. "Thank you what you did for Coach Reed." "I don't know. Principal Petey thanks you," he said. "Now get on." I got on. Do you know what it feels like leaving the principal's office knowing you're going to put a piece of something back and the principal just said thanks? Do you know what it feels like when the principal has told you that you're going to go wherever you want to go? Do you know what it feels like when you think you know just where you want to go and maybe you're already there? It feels like you're on Apollo 11 and the moon is in your sights. That's what it feels like. I brought the brown pelican to the library after the Saturday deliveries. I was a little late because Mrs. Mason had loaded me down with 3 hostas and 5 tall ferns for your mother's perennial garden. When I told her she didn't have one, she said, "Oh, she will, dearie. It's June." Mr. Loeffler had the same idea. He loaded me down with 3 pots of sweet marjoram, which he said everyone needs in his or her garden. Even Mrs. Daughtery figured out that my mother needed a perennial garden. She had dug up a bridal wreath as tall as Ben and wrapped it in burlap. And Mrs. Windermere, she had heard too, I guess. 5 yellow rose bushes. You know how long it takes to wheel all that stuff back home? You know how happy my mother was? I'm not lying. She had the hostas, the ferns, and the sweet marjoram planted before I got back with the bridal wreath, and the bridal wreath planted before I got back with the roses. So I was late to the library, but Mr. Powell didn't care. Somehow he knew about the brown pelican. He had Birds of America open to the right place. We put it in together. "Just one more," Mr. Powell said, but I knew we'd never get it. An anonymous collector from overseas. I shook my head. "The book will always be missing one bird," I said. Mr. Powell shook his head. "Not exactly," he said. "How not exactly?" I said. That Saturday afternoon, I finished my Arctic turn. He was beautiful. He was diving into the water because there was so much for him to find. The waves rolled all around him and were starting to break, and he was going to be fine. He had so much to do. He had so much to see. He was going to go wherever he wanted to go. And he wasn't alone, you know. If you could see the picture like I saw it, there was a whole flock of Arctic terns all around him, all flying above the water, above the waves. And I'm not lying, they were a sight. And after I finished, Mr. Powell opened Birds of America again. He laid my painting in at the place where Audubon's tern was missing. "Nothing is ever perfect," he said, "but this comes pretty close." On the last day of school, Mr. Barber collected his Geography, the Story of the Worlds. He paused for a moment when I handed him mine. It was stained a dark brown. It still smelled of coffee. I think Mr. Barber wanted to cry. On the last day in world history, Mr. McElroy asked us to pass in our final map, which we could make of any place we wanted in the whole world. Do you know what my map was of? Marysville. On the last day in English, we finished selections from Travels with Charlie, and I turned in my travel log assignment. Do you know what I did my travel log assignment on? Let's just say it started at Cape Kennedy and headed up into the sky. And by the way, if I ever do meet Percy Bysshe Shelley, I'm still going to punch him right in the face. On the last day in advanced algebra, Mrs. Verne told us that we had made great progress and that we were far in advance of most 8th grade mathematicians in the state of New York. If we kept up our studies, we would all find next year's Algebra Regents exam to be well within our abilities, and we would fare quite well against all the other algebra students in the great state of New York. Terrific. On the last day of physical science, we watched a film strip about the Project Mercury space missions, 6 manned flights from 1961 to 1963, and about the Project Gemini space missions after them, 10 manned flights from 1965 to 1966. There was a ping before every frame which was enough to make you wish we had never gone into space at all. But when it was finally over, Mr. Ferris turned on the lights and said, "Everything you have just seen is changing. With the flight of Apollo 11, scientific discovery is about to make a giant leap, and those leaps are going to come faster and faster." He held up his slide rule. "Someday people will be buying these in antique shops, and they'll have tiny computers that they carry around with them," which I think he probably meant as a joke, except he didn't laugh. On the last day of PE, Coach Sweattick made us run the mile, and he gave everyone heck if they couldn't do it in under 7 minutes and 43 seconds. He told us that we'd better be running over the summer because they didn't fool around in high school PE. No sirree, Buster. "How about you, Coach?" "Coach," Otis Bottom hollered. Coach Sweattick wheeled around. "If you guys can't cross the line in under 6 minutes, you won't be able to touch me." "Is that a bet, Mr. Bottom?" "That is a bet. Now you know what Lucas will be doing all summer." There was only one more thing that needed to happen for June to be perfect. And it did, for a little while. The last week of the month, when everything was warm and green, when there were hawks gliding on the high breezes, Lil came home. On the first Saturday back, we went to the library together and I showed her the Arctic tern in John James Audubon's Birds of America. She looked at it and started to cry. I told you what art can do to some people. June. But Lil was only home for a couple of weeks, and then she went to Middletown Community Hospital. I think she kept her eyes closed the whole way there. Mr. Spicer took me to see her the morning that Apollo 11 blasted off. You remember how Mr. Daugherty seemed so big in our house? You remember that? Lil's room was filled with huge machines and they made the room tiny. There were pictures of birds on the walls, not even close to good. There were 2 windows, but they were small and so high up that you could only see the sky, and you could only see the sky if you angled your head just right. More tubes, stuff dripping into the tubes, into Lil with a kerchief on when I came in, which she pressed down, dragging her tubes up with her arms, pressing down the kerchief so that I couldn't see that she had no hair, crying. I turned the television on and then lay down on the bed beside her, which took a lot of figuring out, and we watched Apollo 11 blast off to the moon. It was something. First, this flash of light leaps out everywhere, all this fire behind it, and then big clouds of smoke right behind the fire, and then, slowly, like it is barely moving at all, this huge tower of a rocket starts to go up, and you can't believe it's really going up, but it is, and then it starts to tilt a little bit, and then it heads up with the fire beneath it, and up, and suddenly it's hurtling through the blue, flying faster than Audubon could ever imagine. And then it gets smaller and smaller, and you hear people at Mission Control clapping, laughing, and you want to clap and laugh too, which Lil and I did together. It was beautiful, she said. I looked at her. Beautiful, I said. We watched as the flickering light of the fire beneath the Saturn rocket, and I could tell you about the thermodynamics of the fuel if you want to know. We watched as the rocket moved farther and farther up into the sky, heading to the moon, to the moon. To the moon. I held Lil's hand. It was trembling a little, the needle, and when I looked at her I could tell she was thinking of stats, even though they don't mean a thing. You know, she said, if I closed my eyes I could almost be an Arctic tern flying over the water. Close them, I said. She did. Imagine a whole lot of Arctic terns flying around you. A whole lot. She smiled. Now imagine one coming down to fly right next to you to show you the next spectacular thing that's going to come into your life. Bigger smile. Like landing on the moon, she said. Like landing on the moon. Even bigger smile. Her eyes still closed. Will he stay next to me? She said. Always, I said. You think the moon's all there? There's a whole lot more for us to see. Haven't you ever heard of New Zealand? She snuggled closer over the tubes. Always, she said. Always, I said. And I'm not lying. I heard all around us, over the sounds of the huge machines in the room, over the sounds of Apollo 11 heading to the moon, I heard all around us the beating of strong wings.